It began in the heart of the nation. A spark in the form of an unjust death ignited a firestorm across the land. The streets of every major city in America became battlegrounds. Protesters clashed with the police, and soon, it was clear that what started as a protest was now an open rebellion. Cities were aflame with rage, and the cries for justice echoed through the darkened streets. Washington was divided. The Capitol was barricaded, and the president, overwhelmed by the escalating chaos, declared martial law. The National Guard rolled in, tanks rumbling down the avenues, their treads leaving scars on the roads. The skies were filled with the sound of helicopters, drones darting through the thick smoke of the fires. The promise of peace seemed distant, far beyond reach. But it wasn't just the cities. It was the countryside too. Small towns, once serene and quiet, had turned into pockets of resistance. The air was thick with tension. Neighbors became enemies. The divide between the people and their government had never been more apparent. One man, James Hartfield, a former soldier turned mechanic, was caught in the heart of it all. James had always believed in the American dream. He had fought in wars overseas, returned to build a life, but what he came home to was nothing like the world he had left behind. His town, a quiet place nestled in the rolling hills of Missouri, was no longer peaceful. It was now a flashpoint. On the morning of the president's announcement, James watched his neighbors fall in line with the national call for action. He didn't want to fight, he didn't want this chaos. But when the military rolled through, breaking down doors and taking people away, it was impossible to remain on the sidelines. "Get in the truck, James. We're leaving." His wife, Maria, pulled him from his thoughts. She was packing what little they could carry, her eyes full of fear. James shook his head. "We can't just run, Maria. They're coming for everyone. It's not just about us anymore." As he said it, the distant roar of engines echoed through the trees. Black SUVs, armored and silent, came down the dirt road toward his home. He had no choice. They weren't just coming for the rioters anymore, they were coming for anyone who dared resist. "Stay low, stay quiet," he told her, his voice steady, though his heart was anything but. He could feel the weight of the world on his shoulders, the sense of duty pulling him in a direction he never imagined he'd be forced to take. The government had issued curfews. No one was allowed to be out after dark. Roads were blocked. National Guard patrols moved in and out of every major city, enforcing their will, cracking down on the dissent. But the truth was, this wasn't just about control. It was a moment in history when everything fractured. People weren't just fighting for justice anymore, they were fighting for survival. And in the heart of the violence, a new reality was born. James found himself fighting not just for his freedom, but for his soul. He fought for the very essence of America, the right to stand up, to speak out, to have a choice in how he lived. The words of his old commander echoed in his mind: "Freedom isn't something you get. It's something you fight for." The violence continued to spread like wildfire. In the streets of Chicago, men and women ran through the chaos, flames licking at their heels, the sounds of sirens and gunfire blending into an unbearable symphony. Families huddled together, barricading their homes. Businesses that had stood for generations were reduced to rubble. People no longer cared about who was right, they cared only about survival. But in the midst of the destruction, pockets of resistance started to form. In the days that followed, James became part of a network, an underground group that stood against the martial law, against the government that had turned its back on the people. They called themselves the Unbroken. They were fighters, survivors, ordinary men and women who had seen their world crumble and chose to rise from the ashes. Through stolen radios and whispered words, they planned, they strategized. Every day, their numbers grew. James had seen it all, the hope, the anger, the fear, but in that darkness, he found strength. Not just in himself, but in the people around him. They had nothing left to lose, and in that, they found their power. The final battle came on a cold evening, when the sound of helicopters overhead became more than just a sound, it was a warning. The unbroken gathered in a small town square, armed with whatever they could find, rifles, homemade explosives, broken glass. They knew they weren't going to win this fight. But they weren't going to let their country die without a fight. James stood at the front, his voice steady, his eyes locked on the enemy approaching. He looked at Maria one last time. She nodded, holding their child close. "Today, we make history," he said. The ground shook as the military descended. It was the final showdown. The world outside had changed irreparably, but in this moment, they had one last chance to take a stand. They weren't just fighting for themselves anymore, they were fighting for every voice that had been silenced, every injustice that had been buried under the weight of power. And in that moment, in the darkness of a nation on fire, the flames of freedom burned brighter than they ever had before. Epilogue: the dust settled, and the streets were quiet once again. The world had changed, irrevocably so. Some believed it was the end of America as they knew it, while others believed it was the beginning of something new. But one thing was certain, the people had not been broken. They had fought for their right to be free, and in the ashes of what was lost, something new had emerged, something unbroken, something born of resilience, strength, and the unyielding will to be free. The story of that night lived on, etched in the hearts of all those who fought, and those who would never forget the price of liberty.